In this demo, I'm going to refactor some of my earlier code and write a new function to demonstrate using arrow functions. I'm going to start by adding a new property to each of the books in our very tiny library. I'll give each of them an ID property, which will just be a unique number that will make it easier to find and work with books in our code. I now want to modify a bit of code I wrote in the last module to use an arrow function. I'm first going to just add a little comment separator between our growing number of functions and the code I'm writing to call them. I'll eventually start splitting the code across multiple files to keep it better organized. Okay, the code we've already got here gets a list of poetry books and calls the log book titles function to print them to the console. Since our library currently has more fiction books, I'm going to change the name of the variable to fiction books and pass the fiction category to get book titles by category. I'm not going to use the log book titles function anymore. I'm going to replace it with a call to the forEach function available on the fiction books array, and I'm going to pass it an arrow function that will do the logging previously handled by log book titles. All arrays have a function on them called forEach. It takes a function as a parameter, and that function takes 3 parameters. Remember that the parameters for an arrow function appear on the left side of the arrow, and if there are multiple parameters, they must be surrounded with parentheses. In the case of the forEach callback function, val represents the current element in the array, idx or index represents the index of that value, and arr represents the array itself. The function body for our arrow function appears on the right side of the arrow, and it's just a single line. If it were multiple lines, I would have surrounded them with curly braces. I'm just logging the index position of the element and the value, which will be the title of the book. Note that I'm incrementing the index before I log it, just to account for the fact that arrays begin with index 0, and I want nice incremental output beginning with 1. Okay, I think you can see that this is a much simpler syntax than if I implemented an anonymous function using the function keyword. I'll start the compiler build task and then press F5 to run the app. We get the expected output in the console window. Perfect. I'll stop the debugger and go back to the code. I now want to write a new function named getBookById, which will make it easy for us to retrieve books using the new ID property I created on them earlier. The function will take a number parameter that will be the ID of the book we want to retrieve. The first thing I'll do is get all of the books and store them in a constant. Because all books is an array, it has a function on it named filter, which just returns a new array containing, presumably, a subset of the original. The filter function takes a function as a parameter. The function is passed each element in the array and will return true or false to indicate whether the element should be included in the filtered output. Rather than passing an anonymous function to filter, I'm going to pass it an arrow function. I'll only pass it one parameter, so I don't need to wrap that parameter in parentheses like I would if there were 0 or more than one parameter. The body of the function on the right side of the arrow is just a simple Boolean comparison that checks to see if the ID of the current book matches the ID we're looking for. Since I intend to use unique IDs for my books, this function should never find more than one book, which means I can just return the first element in the filtered array. I know this isn't the most robust code in the world, but I want to keep it as simple as possible while still demonstrating the important points. Okay, so there's a second example of an arrow function. It's neat, easy to read, and fits nicely on one line. We've also now got a handy utility function we'll use later in the module. Before we do though, let's talk about function types.